Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking too about how, making these small changes, uh, changes the brain over time, and we create these new kind of habits that then kind of keep pulling us upward. One question I want to ask you though was, since this is the Addicted Mind podcast, we talk a lot about addiction, and a lot of
Hmm.
people who struggle with addiction end up not finding maybe a way out of depression and find some other alternative to just alleviate that pain. And I wonder if you can kind
Right.
of talk about how those interact with each other and
Oh, yeah. It's huge. I mean, it's hugely interactive because, like, the reason why addiction is a problem is very much intricately related to like anxiety and depression. Essentially, like whether you, and this is again one of the problems with like having these like bright line diagnoses, like, well, do I technically have depression or not? Do I have anxiety or do I just have an addiction? Like, the brain doesn't make these strict distinctions. What happens in addiction is you you have these strong negative emotions and activation of the emotional circuitry in the brain and the stress response. And through accident or intention, you've figured out, oh, this particular substance helps me not feel those negative emotions. And that's where the problem comes is because these things do work
right,
to reduce stress or to distract you from your pain or anxiety. And because they work, your brain is like, oh, great. That's the simplest answer. Because there's another part of the brain. So there's the dorsal striatum, which is trying to get you to do what you've always done. And then very closely next to that is the nucleus accumbens, which is trying to get you to do what's most immediately pleasurable and find the easiest path. And so if you're feeling this tension and anxiety and stress, you might not even be aware of it, but it's active in your brain. And you're like, oh, I could go to therapy for a long time. And yeah, that would take a year or two to fix it. And your friend is like, oh, here, have a beer or like, have a hit of this or whatever. And then, oh, then all of a sudden it gives you that immediate feedback and relief. And your brain, that releases a lot of dopamine. And your brain is like, oh, let's do that again. And you do that again because it works. But the problem is that it only works in the short term. And it doesn't actually solve the problem. But you do it because it works. It's just that the more that you do it, well, the chemicals can actually themselves cause changes in your brain, which make you more dependent. But also, the more that you repeat an action, the more that it gets strongly wired in the dorsal striatum, so that every subsequent time, now when you're stressed, your brain is like, I know the answer. Let's have another beer.
right.
And because that's wired in your dorsal striatum, at some point, if you say, no, beer's causing problems, then you choosing not to do that habit increases your stress. And so these unfortunate coping habits that we get stuck in they help, but only in the short term. And once they get trained into our brain, not doing them causes stress. And that stress pushes us and compels us to do them. And that's why it's so hard to break
So
out.
we get caught in these habitual loops. Our brain is trying to stay with the status quo. It says, this works, this is easy, I don't have to make another calculation about this, just go do this. And it pushes us that direction, and then we get caught in it. But what I hear you also saying on the other side of it is if we can make small changes, we can start to change that part of the brain that wants to keep us in that status quo slowly over time and get a different
Right.
reward
Because if you
for
if you
that.
try and change it, right, if you try and change it dramatically, like, no, I'm not going to have any alcohol, and then all of a sudden you have more stress, and all of your other habits, your habits of self-criticism, they get you're like, oh, you're weak, you're gonna give up or whatever, and that stresses you out more, which pushes you, more to falling back on your old, addictive habit. But if you can have compassion for yourself and train that as a habit and say, oh, I know, it's okay. It's difficult. I know you really want to fall back. And it's okay that you want, because sometimes we get mad at ourselves or criticize ourselves for having feelings.
Yeah.
Or for having doubts. And it's like, you can't control the random crap that pops up into your head. And it's okay to have those thoughts and have those feelings. Just, take a different action. And when you're really feeling